Hello and welcome everyone to Beyond Supply Chains, a look at visibility and sustainability. My name is Andrew Staples and I'm the Asia Pacific Head of Policy and Insights at Economist Impact, division of the Economist Group that brings together the rigor of a think tank with the creativity of a media brand to engage an influential global audience. The panel discussions will be starting shortly, but before we begin, I'd just like to say a few words. It's a great honor to open such an exciting and much needed discussion on supply chain visibility and sustainability here in Singapore and at this time where we are with the global economy. We invite you to join us over the next 2.5 hours to discuss how organizations can improve the visibility into and sustainability of their supply chains. This event will take place over 3 panel discussions. The first will cover issues of supply chain visibility and sustainability from a macro and Southeast Asian perspective. The second panel discussion, titled The Bigger Picture, Supporting SMEs in the Supply Chain, will do just that, focusing on the smaller enterprises across the region. And the third and final panel discussion, titled Block to Block, Harmonizing ESG Standards Between Southeast Asia and Europe, will see us beaming in speakers from Singapore, London and Luxembourg for a truly transcontinental discussion on how we can harmonise regulatory regimes between the two regions. A few housekeeping rules before we get underway. It's best to view this over Google Chrome to ensure a seamless swap card experience. You'll also find the full biographies of our speakers and a selection of further readings on the topic on the screen under this media player. Audience interaction is very important to us at Economist Impact, so please do send us your questions and we'll do our best to get them answered by our panel of experts. We'll also be conducting polls throughout the day, and these will be pushed to your console, so please take the time to complete them as your opinions matter to us a great deal. And finally, I would like to thank Standard Chartered for their support today in making these conversations happen. We very much hope that you enjoy the discussions. And with that, I'll pass to my colleague, Meenakshi Barman, for the first panel.
Hello and welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Meenakshi Barman. I'm Senior Manager in the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. In the next 60 minutes, we are going to discuss improving supply chain visibility and sustainability. As we know, supply chain visibility is of extreme importance to businesses today. Visibility is vital for businesses to function effectively, operate efficiently, manage risks, and help reduce costs. However, efforts towards improving supply chain visibility often gets hampered in this part of the world because of Southeast Asia's patchwork for languages, jurisdictions, and regulations. So through this panel discussion, we will aim at understanding how companies in this part of the world can improve supply chain visibility and sustainability. We'll start off by looking at some of the recent disruptions in supply chain due to COVID-19. We'll then move on to focus on visibility and transparency. We will also look at the role of technology in all of this, and finally talk about how best to close the funding gaps. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce our expert panelists. Right next to me is Bert Deprest. He's the Regional Head, Business Development at Engie. Next to him is Kai Fair, Global Head, Trade and Working Capital at Standard Chartered. Next to him is Jeremy Goon, Chief Sustainability Officer at Wilmar International. And next to him is Stephen Beck, Head of Trade and Supply Chain Finance at Asian Development Bank. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thanks.
So to get us started, the recent COVID-19 has caused severe disruptions in supply chain. It really tested the flexibility and resilience of supply chains in this part of the world, as well as globally. But what do you think? How are supply chains now going to evolve? And what does that mean for the sustainability efforts, the ongoing sustainability efforts along supply chains? Jeremy, if we can start with you.
Sure, thank you. I think the recent supply chain disruptions have been certainly exacerbated by COVID. I think we've all seen how commodity prices are for many commodities at all-time highs or multi-year highs. That has certainly increased the cost of food and also the cost of living. And I think the supply chain disruptions because of logistics issues, extreme weather, various different, travel restrictions due to, different governments handling COVID differently as well. the restrictions in terms of labor, for example, migrant labor going into various different, Southeast Asian countries. All of this has been extremely disruptive, and I think it certainly has made efforts to get more visibility and get more sustainability into our supply chains and get more of an understanding and get more of a sort of buy-in from many of the players who perhaps weren't so ready, a bit more challenging. I think it'll take a while for some of these disruptions to normalize, and that has certainly set us back a little, I feel.
Right. Can I start by asking something very basic, like how big an issue is lack of visibility? Why should companies care?
Yeah, actually, if I can jump on that, it's fascinating actually the links between COVID itself, the disruptions, and the lack of transparency and understanding. I think that we have around global supply chains. I mean, no one really talked about supply chains and the importance of supply chains pre-COVID, right? And it was only really when we suddenly realized we weren't able to get the COVID fighting sort of equipment and medicines and all this sort of stuff, test kits and masks and so on, that people became really conscious of just how important supply chains are and how fragile they can be. When the crisis hit, we contacted a number of our partner banks. We provide guarantees and loans to banks at Asian Development Bank to support trade and supply chains. So we contacted a number of our partner banks and said, look, which of your clients are involved in the supply chain for these critical COVID goods? And it was fascinating to realize that no one really knew. And then we went to sort of different health agencies, a variety of different companies, and the extent to which people really understood their own supply chain was actually quite limited. There really is a lack of transparency in this whole space. So I think that the disruption's been, of course, very difficult on everyone, but it also provides us with a tremendous opportunity to realize just how important supply chains are, to realize how we need to drive transparency through those supply chains in order to fix them, in order to understand them, and that is really going to be the basis behind which we can drive more environmentally sort of sustainable practices throughout the supply chains. Because if we don't address sustainability in supply chains, we're not going to be able to realize the targets, ambitious targets that we've set for ourselves. I think I've seen figures like 80% of the carbon footprint can be traced back to supply chains. So it's critical that we drive transparency and address these issues.
If I can just add an example, so it was a post. It's not something I've written myself, but it was a LinkedIn post of somebody posting a can of applesauce, and the can of applesauce said, and that's about transparency because normally you don't know where your applesauce comes from, right? And it said, apples harvested in Argentina, packed in Thailand, and it was an American customer buying this in an American warehouse. So there you see, let's say, the key issue, right? So their transparency is so important because if you would see that when you buy it off the shelf, I feel that especially in a post-COVID scenario, customers start to get sensitive of this, and customers really start to think, okay, why should I buy this can of applesauce? Well, actually, you can buy it from the local farmer, much better, much healthier, and I think that's the key. What my fellow panelists are trying to say as well is that without transparency, as a customer, you don't know. So as a customer, you don't know, you can't really make a difference.
And I think that's also something we see across all our client spectrum, right? The visibility of supply chain, like Steve explained and Jeremy touched on, becomes so much more important. How did you sell previously your product? You need to create a very good product. And then marketing came into it, where the marketing laid over the message around the good product. And like Bert said, now there's a third element. It's the product, the marketing, but it's also the sourcing. Where does my product come from? How, in your example, the apple, which is packed somewhere else and it is harvested and sold somewhere else, how does my supply chain actually work? And that is something, yes, Jeremy, it's all disrupted, but the opportunity here is that for the first time, supply chain becomes a boardroom discussion. We have clients who are in the operation department of our clients, and they dress with a suit and a tie, and we ask them, why are you dressing for a suit and a tie? They say, well, I'm every week with a boardroom, I need to explain how the supply chain works. So that visibility we see right now, that's a huge opportunity for us. We'll talk obviously about sustainability in this field, but that this becomes a boardroom discussion, that this becomes a consumer discussion, that it becomes so much more visible that why do we actually need cows? Because the milk is in the supermarket? that type of discussion saying, well, hang on a second, where does it originate from? Where's the source coming from? Packing this again into the product, the marketing, and the sourcing. It all now comes together, and that's the opportunity we have here to crack this between the physical supply chain of our clients and the financiers, what the ADB and us as a commercial bank are doing, merging the physical supply chain with a financial supply chain with a lot more visibility, because everybody now talks about supply chain.
It's funny, this 2020 hindsight, it seems so obvious now, doesn't it? But if we had this conversation a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure how many people would be interested. And it's interesting to see just how actually difficult it is to trace the supply chain. We contracted some data scientists to map out the supply chain for these critical sort of COVID goods, which can be found on the ADB's website. But the amount of data that's available to do that and to do it accurately is actually challenging, and something that the international community needs to come together on and have a discussion about how to improve our ability to map these supply chains to drive the transparency we need.
Thanks. So more than ever, COVID has sort of put a spotlight on supply chain, and it's become more critical right now. It's important that we also take in our audience opinions. So if we can have the first poll question, I'd request the audience to key in your results, which I'll share with all of you shortly. But the question is, whose support is most important when encouraging corporations to invest in supply chain visibility in Southeast Asia? NGOs, financial institutions, governments and regulators, or the consumers? While the audience is answering that, Jeremy, if I can come to you. So different companies have different approaches towards transparency and visibility. Could you talk a bit about how did Wilmar International get started on this journey? And what was the initial reception like from the industry? And what were your learnings?
Thanks. I think that's a very good question. One of the things that we're always asked was, how did this all start? And it started perhaps before most of the others within our sector were perhaps prepared or willing to acknowledge there was a problem or willing to go down this road. But I think we live in a world today where the supply chains are so integrated, and the information that your customers require are more than ever before. It is not acceptable anymore to say to your customers, be it if you're an FMCG or a trader or processor, that you don't know where your raw material comes from. If you don't know where your raw material comes from, then you won't know whether it's sustainable or not, or whether it has caused deforestation or not, for example. So I think that was one of the drivers that certainly sent us on our journey. And I can tell you that when we first went down this path, when we were the first company within many of the agricultural sectors to publish a mill list, for example, for our oil palm business. And we published a list of exactly where the 1,000 mills that we were buying from were. And there was massive pushback from the rest of the industry at that point in time. Many of them said, what are you guys doing? Why would you give out this information? And there was pushback from various different stakeholders, including certain regional governments as well. But fast forward 18 months, 2 years, everyone else within our industry decided that, yeah, I think we're all going to publish our mill list as well, because. But that leads me on to another point where we've only tapped into perhaps what we would analyze as 75% of the industry today. There is still another 25%, which we would consider the leakage market. And those are the guys who are still not convinced on going down this path because of various different reasons or agenda they may have. And that is where perhaps the biggest problems lie. If not, this 25% is not, if there isn't a spotlight or a an attempt to have an engagement with them to say, look, we need the rest of you guys to come on this journey as well. The leakage market could grow because the problem is we don't live in a place where there is homogeneous demand. You have many markets today where they don't mind that it could come from an unsustainable place. The only thing they care about is the price. And that perhaps has been exacerbated a little bit by the supply chain disruptions. Many of the customers, for example, in some of the more developing countries, are just looking at the cheapest available product. They're not looking at a sustainable solution right now. They're just trying to put food on the table. And for many of these developing countries, that is still a big issue that we all have to deal with. But as leading companies in the space, it's our responsibility to also take the smaller players along in our journey. And I think that's very important. So the engagement and the collaboration between the various different parties, big and small, prepared and not so prepared, is, in my opinion, the key to getting everyone along this path and to get a better sort of buy-in from everyone and to make this whole process easier.
Thanks, Jeremy. Clearly, there's also a need to incentivize these players, right? So, Steve, if I can come to you, are we seeing businesses incentivized properly? And how can we encourage more players to commit to these sustainable practices? For example, are we seeing companies engage with NGOs, governments? Yes, what do you think about the incentivization process?
Well, Bart made reference to, I guess the fact that consumers are interested in buying stuff that they have some confidence in, that's not harmful to the environment, and I think that goes a certain way, that sort of social moral sort of obligation that I think we're all becoming more and more conscious of. I'm not sure that it's enough, though, and I think Jeremy, referenced a sort of price signaling sort of aspect in the market, which is pretty hard to beat in terms of an incentive, I think. So, of course, there's the carbon tax, which has been very widely debated, and don't need to sort of get into that now. But there are a couple of other factors I think that could serve as really important incentives. One is coming at it from the financial point of view, is if we can agree on standards, and there's a big discussion to be had on standards, and Kai, we've talked about this too, it's very important for our industry, to try to determine what constitutes a green loan and a green guarantee. And if we can do that in trade finance, for example, and then if we can link that to the amount of regulatory capital, in other words, the cost to doing that transaction with regulatory bodies around the world, then we're going to be driving in a price incentive in a very sort of structural way that should filter through to companies and so on. If it's cheaper for a bank to provide a green loan, then that should pass through to companies and then theoretically consumers. So I think that it's important to work on that as a global sort of collective industry. Second thing is, I don't know who said it, but transparency is a great driver of change. And Jeremy, I think you were making reference, to you guys publishing the list of suppliers. And there are a variety of efforts now internationally, and some stock exchanges are requiring sort of reporting on sustainability, and some regulators, other regulators as well. This is a very important area, and also an area where there needs to be more collaboration and cooperation to drive a standard sort of reporting format, I think. So yeah, lots to be done on the incentives front.
If I can chip in on that, because I think when you talk about incentives, I think you talked about standardization, but when you talk about incentives, most people think about subsidies, right? It's okay, am I paid to do that? And that was a big driver. If you look back to Europe, you see why is the adoption of renewable energy so big in Europe, because there have been incentives. That said, it's not always the right way to go, because you now see in Europe that basically many governments actually struggle to keep on paying these incentives to these early stage developers, which now means that the people that have not been adopting these or not benefiting from the incentives now actually pay a higher energy tariff, paying for the incentives for the people that did. And actually in Asia, you've seen that the governments have not been that, let's say, early adopter or early movers with giving these incentives in particular for renewable energy. And if you now look at it, maybe as well for the right reasons, because you now see as well that there are actually economical business models that allow you to adopt sustainable practices without incentives. So we now see, and in particular with the surging energy prices in the post-COVID scenarios, because of demand is picking up everywhere on the globe, you now see that companies actually save when adopting sustainable practices. We were just discussing this with Jeremy from Wilmar. We do a partnership, for example, with Logos, where actually developers, customers, producers are actually partnering with companies like Engie to bring these sustainable solutions to life in a partnership setup. Like 10 years ago, companies started to say, listen, supply chain, I actually don't need that. I do outsourcing of my supply chain. And that's where come in the big players, that's where come in DHL, that's where come in the warehouse providers. But now the next wave you start to see is, why don't think similar around sustainability? Okay, you're a core business, you produce a good sustainability, simply you need to recognize is not your core business. So instead of actually just looking to incentives, there are now new business models arising, business models as a service, that allow companies to actually adopt sustainable practices, both in their operations as in their supply chain. Right. Actually don't have to upfront money, don't valorize incentives, but still have savings because of many of these technologies simply are at what we call grid parity. So that's an important element as well. It's not because there are no incentives that you cannot start acting today.
Thanks, Bert. Bert, if I can ask you, what do you think, since you're an expert on sustainability and supply chains, where do you think the support can come from to push the sustainability agenda for supply chain in Southeast Asia? How do you see the support take form?
Yeah, so I think before even going to support, it's what I just alluded, that you actually don't necessarily need that support. I think the first element is many companies are already voluntarily putting in, under an RE100, putting in commitments to go what they call net zero. So I think that's the first step. That's even without support, companies need to take a voluntary pledge. If the voluntary pledge is not there, you actually see it as well as was said already today. You see that these standards coming forward. You're actually in the next wave, like of accounting, where we were with accounting 10 years ago. You came up with IFRS, with US GAAP. You have all of these rules. You now actually see that in IFRS guidelines, there needs to be a separate chapter. How are we going to report? How are we going to report key figures around sustainability, which are carbon emissions, which are basically all the UN goals that you can name, correct? And then in terms of support, I think the government has a role to basically as well make sure that the infrastructure is there. Like, take an example, renewable energy. You see in many regions, it's still not allowed to in some regions or in some countries, it's still not allowed to put in solar panels on top of your roof. Right. Like here in Singapore, we can put it on and you can sell it as a service on a lease. But if you, for example, go in Indonesia, where you still have a regulated market, it's not as easy yet just to put in rooftop solar panels and as a third party lease that, because you're actually breaking the monopoly that's in place in these countries. So the government, at the government sides in terms of support, they need to have the right regulatory framework which allows for new solutions to be adopted, which sometimes goes in against the incumbent, because you have incumbent players in these countries, incumbent utility companies that actually benefit from high energy prices, that actually benefit from a monopoly. So it's important that the support regulatory-wise there, and then in terms of support, it's as well important that you have the infrastructure. Like, for example, if you want to adopt, so electrification will be a very important driver to basically make our supply chains more sustainable. But then if you look, is it really possible? Is it really possible in a warehouse in Singapore to have 20 trucks to charge at the same time? No, it's not, because you don't have the chargers, you don't have the high tension grid basically going to this warehouse. So it's super important that at a government level there is a support structure to actually have the infrastructure for players, for companies themselves to enroll the solutions. And then it's actually the industry that will follow. I'm convinced of that.
So it's a blend of both.
And if it comes to that kind of support, that's obviously where institutions like the ADB and the private banks, then the Chartered come in to support and fund that very infrastructure build. On the support side, I want to quickly come back to the point Jeremy raised, which is really important to understand that we need to get the financing support right in the supply chain, because there's a lot of financing out. You've heard maybe about the green bond, green project financing, and this is fantastic. This is really good. But it doesn't solve what we all need to solve here, because it's a fraction of the market. The green bonds is a fraction of the total market. The project financing, nothing wrong in financing a solar plant. There's nothing wrong in financing windcraft financing. We should all do more of that, provide the financial support to the physical supply chain. Nothing wrong with it. But in order to solve the fundamentals of getting our planet into the right form and shape, we need to crack what this panel here is discussing, is a financial supply chain across each and every leg of our supply chain. This is where the support is really needed. Steve talked about it in terms of regulatory treatment for supply chain, which sets the financial incentive, because at the end of the day, let's face it, a lot of the support is, do I get funded? It's not only the anchor, using supply chain language, the buyer who ultimately carries the weight for it. At the forefront, companies like Wilmar and Engie, the multinationals in our survey talking about the future of trade finance. Almost all the big companies, multinationals, are signing up for this. Fantastic. But we need to reach down in the supply chain, the support where it's actually needed at the level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and so on of the supply chain, down to the producer level, which then ships the commodity or the raw material, the good, further on down the supply chain. This is where the financial support is needed. And that is something the banks need to develop. I'm pretty proud that in Stanchart, and Steve mentioned this, what is needed is a framework to define each of these complex legs in the supply chain. How do you provide financing to each leg of the supply chain in a sustainable fashion? So you need, as an organization, a financier, a very, very clear framework to know what is sustainable financing and what is outside across all the products. Right? We have guaranteed products, we have loan products, we have letter of credit, account receivables we finance. How do you apply the financing on the level of the supply chain with a very, very clear framework we can later talk about? That's really one of the key ingredients to provide exactly that financial support where it is needed, down there in the supply chain. This is exactly where it's needed.
If I can just add on to your point, because it's a fantastic point, and I've had many discussions in over the years where we've all sat in a room and we've all said, guys, it's the wrong people again in the room, if you know what I mean. And you're absolutely right. The issue is, it's not actually us who need the green bonds. It's those people who actually, the banks are not willing to finance. They're the ones that actually need the most incentive. They're the ones that actually have to have the buy-in. They will be the ones to benefit from the incentives of green financing. They're the people, not the big, multinationals.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's look at what our audience thinks about who can provide the maximum support for companies here in Southeast Asia to invest in their supply chains. So clearly, governments and regulators at 64%, the consumer 26%, financial institutions at 9%, and NGOs at 2%. I'd like to ask our panelists, what do you think about this result?
Intuitively, it feels right. I would have predicted that the consumer is higher. The percentage, even if we round it up, it's not even a third of it. I've in a way hoped that all of this is driven through the consumer, because this actually creates the change. And we talked about the visibility of supply chain. This all goes back to the consumer who demands that visibility. I was recently in a store here in Singapore, tried to buy a kitchen knife. So go through the shelves and see one kitchen knife, expensive one, looked at it, and it says produced sustainable. So this is where the consumer comes in. If the consumer asks, I want, what I've mentioned earlier, that the product needs to be good, I like your marketing, but you need to explain to me where it comes from. This changes the behavior. This changes everything. And I think this is where it has to start with. And then regulation can help boost that. So again, from looking at the 26% from a consumer, I would have hoped this number is a little bit higher.
Okay.
Meenakshi, I mean, regardless of what the percentages are, I'm sure we all agree that at the end of the day, it's a shared responsibility. I mean, clearly.
Absolutely.
And just to pick up on the really important point that Kai and Jeremy were emphasizing about the supply chain and support, including financial support for the sort of lower stream end of the supply chain. There is a real danger as we move forward with standards and in greening our supply chains that we leave out the SMEs, the smaller sort of companies, right? That maybe don't have the financial backing, the expertise, the ability to move up the curve, the sustainability curve as quickly as we would like. So we all, really need to keep an eye on that critical ball. And I think one piece of that, how to address that, is really in the way that we think about supply chain financing, right? Where we look at the whole supply chain and start to look at this sort of deep tier, as we call it, right, of financing, which is also a real challenge in the supply chain sort of finance sector. So we need to keep our eye on that ball, and there are some potential solutions that are pretty exciting.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Steve. And that's something certainly from a Stenchart perspective we look at. We have a great partner, and I hope you're listening. We have a great partner in China at the forefront of exactly this, where we're not actually conceptualizing deep tier financing. It is live. We have now 14 clients on it with, I think, almost 800 suppliers. So what it does is exactly addressing the deep tier financing aspect. So what the platform creates is two things. One, an easy onboarding. If you are an SME type of client, how complicated is it for you to go on a bank channel onboarding? What the platform has created is the opportunity to onboard with facial recognition and other ways to make it much easier for an SME to get onboarded. Platform technology ticks this. The second aspect is the deep tier financing. So what the platform creates on the strengths of the buyer, of the big companies, creates a financial token, which then travels down the supply chain and actually can even be broken. So the supplier can opt to pay 2, 3 of his supplier by breaking up the token. And it's fascinating technology because it achieves two things. It provides deep tier financing and visibility. And this visibility told us that in one extreme example, we finance the 11th level of a supply chain. The general level is 2 to 3 levels down. But this is a critical, important point that we are not doing this with our partner in China for the benefit of the Chinese economy. We want to venture this out into other markets. So deep tier financing, Steve, I couldn't agree more. That is something we collectively as an industry, not only for Standard Chartered, but also for others need to crack. Provide the financing where it is needed, on the basis of one technology, and secondly, the visibility we create with a token which travels again through the supply chain.
Thanks, Kai. Very interesting insights on supply chain financing. Can we have the second poll question, please? Do you believe that your company has invested enough in technology to make an impact on its supply chain visibility and sustainability? Yes or no? While the audience is answering that, I'd really like to unpack the role of technology in all of this. So, Steve, I understand that at ADB, you are focusing on this a lot through your work. So what do you think, how do you think that technology can play a role in furthering transparency and visibility in supply chains?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Meenakshi. Yeah, technology is critical in driving transparency throughout the supply chain, understanding it better, and enabling us to be able to verify and monitor in an efficient way with confidence environmental standards throughout the supply chain. Of course, it's easier said than done. It's a huge challenge. It also links back to making global supply chains and global trade more robust. Digitalization of global trade and supply chains is a critical piece of that. So there are a couple of things that we think are major impediments to us moving up the curve on digitalization of global trade and supply chains. One is a lack of standards and protocols to drive interoperability between different component parts of the supply chain sort of trade ecosystem, if you will. And by that I mean from exporters to shippers, to ports, to customs, to warehousing, to finance and importers. If we can make that whole process a seamless, frictionless, sort of digitalized process, the amount of transparency that we'll be able to gain throughout the supply chain will enable us to layer on top some technology to be able to do that sort of verification and monitoring that I referred to earlier. The second thing is that we need, that's impeding our ability to move up the curve, is legislation. Most governments actually don't have legislation that recognize electronic documents. And so we're never going to be able to move up the curve sufficiently if we don't have that legislation in place. And so on the first one, we've worked with the government of Singapore and the International Chamber of Commerce to create the Digital Standards Initiative, which is bringing together all these disparate sort of groups within the ecosystem, the supply chain ecosystem, to agree on these standards, the data elements and so on that would flow through the system. And then on the second point, we've been advocating very strongly with governments that they adapt model legislation that's been designed by the United Nations specifically on that. So these are huge challenges, but also, you know, as we recognized before, huge opportunities. We also need to drive innovation because we lack the sort of tools and mechanisms to do that kind of monitoring, and this is also something we need to work on together.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to this point, and maybe it's helpful for the audience to illustrate this, what Steve has said from why is the transparency so critical? Why is that framework so critical? So if you finance a project, you have time to make your due diligence. So you can assess the project, you can ask questions, and you come to a conclusion and you can label as, yes, this is a sustainable project, because you have months time to make this assessment. In the supply chain financing world, it's a running hamster wheel. It's millions of transactions, Standard Chartered alone processes. So we get an invoice from our clients, or we get a guarantee from our clients, we get a letter of credit, an account receivable from our client. These are the trade instruments. So we have it in front of us, and now how do we make a judgment call? Is that something we finance sustainable, or is it something from a non-sustainable source? And this is exactly where the visibility, the transparency is critically important, and the framework. So you need to have the tools, the equipment ready, and the technology Steve talked about to say, okay, this invoice we are asked to finance, we have full transparency around the deep tier financing where it originates from. So it's from a producer. It goes through a logistic company. It maybe goes to a crushing plant. It goes into production, and it goes into packing. So do we have all the visibility that each and every step of that logistic has that been shipped by an electronic vehicle? Is it a diesel vehicle? All these type of steps, we want visibility as a financier, but we need this visibility ad hoc, because unlike the project financing, we will have 3 months, 4 months to make a due diligence. We have a couple of hours with our demanding clients saying, you need to finance this now. My invoice is due. I need to pay now. So how do we make this judgment call? So this is absolutely critical, important, what Steve has just said. We need to get the technology part right to give us that flexibility to finance on the spot something which is sustainable, and we have evidence that it really originates from a sustainable source. So if you are listening, if you are an Engie or if you're a tech company, please partner with us, with our clients, with the ADB, with us to find that technology and make us better to create that transparency. For some parts, certainly the industry has cracked it, our client has cracked the code, but we are not there yet. So absolutely critical, important to get this right.
Thanks, Guy. Clearly, technology is very, very important to boost transparency. But if I can come to you, as companies take up more technologically driven, data-driven approaches, you also mentioned about how important electrification is and the supporting infrastructure for technological adoption is. Can you talk a bit about the kind of shortages or the kind of skills shortages in particular that the region is facing? Or is there any other kind of shortage that you want to allude to?
Well, if you would look to electrification and if you look to the technologies, I think it's the biggest component that is lacking is probably still the low duration and the efficiency of the new technologies. Because face it, and I think you could split it in last mile, right? So in last mile, you see that's just driving your own car home. And there you now see the adoption of electrical car is irreversibly, right? Yeah. 10 years from now, there will be no more carbon combustion engines, my personal opinion, on the road. And it just doesn't make sense. Like I was in Europe, was driving, even you drive there 200-300 kilometers just to go from one customer to the others. Why would you burn $20 of fuel while actually when you drive an electrical car, it barely costs you $1 or $2 to charge at home overnight? So that's clear. But what is that last mile, I think, is clear. But what is still a problem in today's world is, let's say, these longer duration cycles, right? What if you're a bus operator and you're actually operating buses for 24 hours? We're talking about supply chain, so let me put this in let's say, trucks. If you're driving trucks across the region from one country to the other, the truck driver basically that each day brings his apples from the north of Malaysia into Singapore, that drives literally overnight 800 kilometers to transport apples from Malaysia to Singapore. There, I think the technology is still early in its adoption, and their electrification is not yet the solution because that truck driver simply drives 800 kilometers to get here. But there as well, you see where Tesla is now. They now announced the truck, and you see these first proof of concepts coming to market. You go back Tesla 10 years ago, they were announcing the electrical, their Roadster. Everybody's saying, who needs a Roadster? But now they're at the Tesla 3, and you see it's getting economical. So same is to be expected, first of all, for trucks. Then there will be additional carriers as well coming forward. So you now have hydrogen. So if you look to the world balance of energy, it's pretty simple. In Europe, if you now go to Europe, and on a day there is a lot of wind, there's too much energy, and energy prices are negative. In Australia, when you go to the center of Australia or to the Middle East, there is simply too much sun with already panels that only operate at 20–30% efficiency. So if you see these efficiencies going up, these solar panel prices increasing, you're going to see that practically just with natural resources, you're going to come to a close to zero production price of energy. If you can translate that into by either batteries or other carriers such as hydrogen, which are still expensive as well if you can carry it around, you will come to a real situation where you then will see that second, not the last mile, the transport pick up. You'll see it for trucks. Once it works for trucks, you're going to see it's going to work for boats. If it works for boats, it's going to work for planes. So these technologies simply need adoption. But you see these early signs are there. And basically it will take time, but I'm quite convinced that in a matter of 5 to 10 years, or at least we see in a matter of 5 to 10 years, that you will actually have hydrogen as a sustainable fuel. You will start to import hydrogen into Singapore. You will produce your power from hydrogen or another carrier, whatever that might be at that point in time. And you will just have your supply chain fully electrified. Which basically will allow that you're practically having a carbon neutral supply chain through intense electrification.
Great. So a slow start, but a positive outlook.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Great. Okay, so our poll results are in, and 71% of our audience thinks that their company is not investing enough in supply chain. Pretty strong numbers.
That's shocking. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Moving on, we'll now unpack the funding gaps that exist in supply chain financing. So Kai, if I can come to you, can you talk a bit about the role of financial institutions in supporting and driving this sustainability agenda across supply chains? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've touched it on various aspects already. So the problem you have in the financing of the supply chain is the topic about visibility, traceability, which we've talked about. The critical component is something Steve has mentioned. It's a framework. So let us spend a little bit of time on why is a framework so important. So I talked about that hamster wheel, right? The hours you have to make an assessment whether you finance something sustainable or not. So what the banking industry is doing, and Steve mentioned the work we're doing with the ICC, with the BAF, so these are lobby groups who try to come up with a standard that frankly not good enough. That Standard Chartered has a very solid standard and a framework for sustainable supply chain financing. We need all the banks to come on board if we solve a global problem like we've concluded here. So the framework needs to have several elements, right? You have the end user. So that's where you have time to make the due diligence, saying, okay, who is the end user? So for instance, a solar plant or windcraft financing. So you can make your diligence. The second aspect are transition industries. So you need a framework for how do you help your clients who want to transition. They are not green yet. They are not sustainable yet, but they want to become green. So some of the oil companies certainly are on the way from being oil to becoming something very sustainable and green. So how does your framework from a financier looks like to support these type of industries? And then it's obviously the transaction. And this is when it gets really difficult. Huh? Remember, the hamster wheel, the 1-2 hours you have time. So this is when we partner with NGOs and certification bodies, where the banker is not the best position to make a call on whether something originates from a sustainable source and is shipped sustainable. We work with clients like Wilmar, who did all the homework in their space and introduced us to the idea of the certificate. So there's the RSPO, for instance, for sustainable palm oil, but there are multiple certification bodies out there. And that is what we've built into our frameworks for sustainable supply chain financing. We use other people's intelligence and the due diligence they did on a situation for cotton initiatives, wherever your supply chain originates from. Use the certification, trusted certification. That's a time and investment we spend with clients on the due diligence, on these certification bodies, working with supranationals like the ADB, IFC, and others to look into what do we believe is the right certification. Once we've done the certification, now we have a possibility that our clients attach to the instruments we want to finance that very certification, which tells us something originates from a sustainable source. And it's almost as easy as that. And I'm telling you, if you try to implement it in your financial institution, devil is in the details, not that easy. But in principle, it is that easy. You use that certification. You use the knowledge somebody has done through their due diligence process and embedded in the respective supply chain of our clients. And that raises the awareness and the transparency around what do you want to finance. And that is something we are working again with the ADB, with others to lobby this framework outside Standard Chartered for the benefit of our clients, but for everyone who is in the business of financing something sustainable. Because without the financing element, the physical supply chain will not change as fast as we need it. So the financial supply chain have to adopt this framework. And we heard Steve talking about, and I know you're passionate about it. We have to get that right. So everyone who wants to join Steve, myself, and many others who are working on it to get it right for our industry, please join us.
Kai, you've done a really good job of bringing it down to earth, making it very tangible. So digitalization, layering on top of that the sort of the tools and tech mechanisms to do exactly what Kai was describing, and ensuring that we're bringing everyone along, throughout the tier. And linking back to your question, Minakshi, about funding gaps, we put out a study some months ago that identifies global financing gap for trade finance of $1.7 trillion. And I suspect that the number is actually higher than that, because when we collected the data, that was just before that huge spike in inflation, particularly for commodities such as food and energy, which are going to be eating in those higher sort of dollar values of transactions, will eat into what available country and counterparty limits exist to support trade. So the gap is large. And of course, it's concentrated mostly on the SMEs that we were referring to earlier. This is a huge challenge, and lots of work to do, as Kai says. But there is work being done, and it's exciting to see what we're going to be doing together. I'll be interested to hear more about the deep tier financing, Kai. That's quite an accomplishment.
We will. I think we have a meeting after that.
Yeah, good.
Great. Moving forward, just to sum it up and also to build a future outlook now, I would invite our panelists to maybe put in one or 2 points on what they think, to sum up, should be the future outlook for what companies should be doing to increase supply chain visibility, just to bring it all together, 1 or 2 points. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the main point for us is what Jeremy said. You want to be in the forefront with your organization to make that step. And certainly Wilmar did this many years ago. And I recall that at the time, 8-9 years ago, we started talking about that. Literally nobody was interested in this. So now, as we've evidenced through the discussion here, it's a lot more visible. So it's easier to come out and to be clear, what do you need to do. But I think that there's also another element which we can't ignore, and in a way it brings us to where we started, is the current environment. So what I also want to share, not deviating what we want to achieve in the long term, is the current situation. I think everyone listening and being in the supply chain business, rely on supply chain. What we hear from clients is quite worrisome what will happen over the next couple of months. You have port closures in the US. LA port got closed. We in Standard Chartered are looking at a situation where our team members in some of our hubs being severely impacted by the Omicron variants. Thankfully, it is not as severe as it was with a previous mutation we have seen. So the recovery rate will be there, but people will get sick, and that's again. We talked about the visibility in supply chain. This will get very visible. I talked about the port. It's a producer, it's a processing, it's your retail shop, it's your bank. Thankfully, banks have BCP protocols, but everyone will be impacted over the next couple of months. So be prepared that resilience and prioritization of supply chain is really critical. Work with your bank. Make sure that you are well financed down your supply chain with a disruption which will happen. Right, the way of how supply chains were operated just in time, there's no more. You have to have stock. Right, just in case will be the new norm, but this stretches out your working capital substantially. So you need banks at your side who finance you, who understand how a supply chain business works. So this was a message to everyone listening. The next 2 to 3 months, I predict, can be disruptive. That's where we started. Then back to what we've just talked about. So many takes away from visibility on the transparency. Learned a lot. Thanks, Brett, on everything we talked about in the energy space, and a lot more to do there. And I know exactly what you mean. We try to buy an electric car, but the Conno is not ready there.
Go,
so
yeah.
it's, right, there's a lot to be done. Thankfully, Singapore being at the forefront. Then we also heard from Steve on electronic bill of lading, right? So yes, the world needs to get into an electronic title regime. The best technology doesn't help you. Thankfully, again, Singapore being at the forefront of it, but trade is global. It doesn't help that only Singapore has an electronic title regime. We need other countries to adopt this. So in short, there's a lot to be done. I'm really proud what, in particular, our clients have done. And let's be honest, the clients were always at the forefront of it. The bankers, the finance are catching up to it. We talked about the framework. I think we're on a really great path here. But be mindful of the next couple of months, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, Kai. Thanks for summing up everything so well. We just have enough time for a few audience questions, so we'll jump to that. The first question, who should be paying for the certification and auditing of sustainable supply chains, the producer or the consumer?
For me, as I've said, I make the link with accounting, right? It's not even a discussion who is paying for an audited accountant report. That's the producer. So, well, I mean, eventually the producer, let's say, priced it in as part of their consumptions, but it's a responsibility. It's the first responsibility of the producer. I was surprised as well by the poll. And actually, if you look, in the poll, it said 70% basically expect that it are the authorities that should push sustainability. But then we look as well to the poll, is your company pushing sustainability? And 70% of the companies are not pushing sustainable. So it's actually, so there's still a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I think it's most definitely the producers and not the authorities, not the consumers, the producers of the goods that need to take their responsibility and drive it all the way through the supply chain.
Okay. Next question is on trusting data. So to improve supply chain visibility and sustainability, we need data, and data around this can always be a challenge. So how do we trust the data that is being collected and reported?
Yeah, I think this in large part goes back to technology and digitalization and transparency. So that's a key piece. And then us working together to develop the kind of reporting standards that are comprehensive and comparable are going to be important components.
Okay. Is it better to create sustainability league tables or benchmarks which are published and effectively forces companies to improve?
I think it sort of is already starting, correct? So you have the voluntary pledges, you have RE100. So you see companies already looking to their peers. It's like what Jeremy was saying, right? They started to publish data, so competition follows. So in my personal opinion, I don't think you need a league table. I think you just have a first mover advantage, and I feel that it's a snowball effect, right? As soon as the ball starts rolling, the others will follow suit.
Thanks, Bode.
Maybe just to add on to that, I think one of the issues that we need to perhaps bear in mind as well is the reputational aspect of this. And I think that certainly in the industries that we operate in, the reputational aspect is normally lost by those who are committed and want to do something or have a reputation to lose. For those who don't have a reputation to lose and they are not bothered with sustainability, they're not so bothered about the reputational aspect. So, to me, this is a very difficult situation that you're in because they're the ones who will continue to do it, but they're not the ones who are affected. It's the ones who want to do good whose reputation is affected by those who, like I mentioned before, the leakage market, for example.
Right. So someone in our audience wants to know that, so they don't know if, I don't know if my supplier's disclosures and guarantees are truthful, unless someone does an audit on site, which is expensive and a pain. Any ideas?
Yeah, that's, again, a little bit down to the sort of reputational aspect. We've dealt with many different so-called auditors or certification bodies, but I'd also like to point out that there are differences as well. And you can have accredited certification bodies, but we've also noticed that there are differences in terms of quality and standards as well. So unfortunately, there is no way to guarantee it. And you mentioned here, unless someone does an audit on site, and so can you trust that person? Because at the end of the day, it's down to it's again, you can have all the data you want, but it's interpretation and transparency in terms of how the data is given, or do you fully disclose the data? How do you interpret it? How do you analyze it? That's still something which I think is difficult to have a process where you can guarantee 100% of the time that it's going to be done in the right way. And I think this is something which you're going to have to go back to the companies involved and trust on their branding and their brands and reputation to say, look, if there is an issue, we're not 100% right all the time, we're not 100% perfect, but we will always work with the various different stakeholders to resolve it and get it right. And we will always be transparent about it. I think perhaps that to me is the best way to do it. You cannot guarantee.
And I think that That's really important. That's so important because what the question also carries is I better not do it because I'm not 100% sure. How can I be really sure that somebody has done their homework, which is fair, which is a fair question, but we need to approach it in the way Jeremy has outlined it. We have to start somewhere. Is it perfect right now? And I've mentioned some of the certification bodies. There's a Better Cotton Initiative and many, many other certification bodies. Do they always get it right? No. But if we point at ourselves and say, well, this is an example where it didn't go right, we lose the momentum of starting it. We all will get better, and certainly with a panel here, with the companies involved here, we all want to get it better. So by not pointing at us saying, well, this is what you get wrong, speak about the 99% where we get it wrong and work with us how we get things better. It's really critically important, Jeremy, so couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and lastly, it shouldn't be expensive. So you can contact me, I'm happy to pay for it. So it shouldn't be a pain, it shouldn't be expensive, just call me, I will do it, and if you work with me after in the implementation, I'll do it for free.
It is definitely a journey. We need to start somewhere, and I think this is where there's a real opportunity for the private sector to innovate new techniques and mechanisms to provide the confidence throughout the entire supply chain that standards are being met. We're going to put together a directory that lists those mechanisms and tools so we understand what the landscape is. That might sort of help understand where we are and what the opportunities are to ramp up.
Great. We are just in time. Thank you for this fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time. Thanks, audience, for your time. And with this, I'll pass it on to Andy for the next panel. Thank you.